Welcome to Virtual Grand Rounds. My name is Shannon Strader. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee, and I am this year's AADMD Virtual Grand Rounds facilitator. For those that are new, Virtual Grand Rounds are a webinar-based presentation model that creates a space for mentorship and exchange of knowledge experience between seasoned IDD providers, entry-level clinicians, and future healthcare providers in training. The purpose of the Grand Round sessions is to expand and strengthen the IDD healthcare workforce across the spectrum of experience levels. After this meeting, we'll be sending out a survey monkey for feedback on how to improve these meetings. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you may write your questions on the sidebar, and we will go over them and as many as we can as time permits at the end of the lecture. It gives me great pleasure in introducing our presenter this evening. Dr. Ty Aller is a Ph.D. He is the training coordinator for the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center and is housed in the Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University. Ty is also practicing marriage and family therapist in northern Utah with specializations in serving adolescents and their families that have experienced trauma using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral acceptance, commitment therapy, and dialectal behavior therapy. Ty completed his doctoral studies at Utah State University in human development and family studies, where he studied the effectiveness of a mental health education curriculum. In his free time, Ty enjoys watching USU Augie sports and spending as much time in the outdoors hiking, camping, fishing, and biking as possible. All right, you guys, or you can go ahead if you would like. We're very excited to have you tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for the introduction. You actually covered a lot of that. I forgot that I didn't need to go into the bio, so this will be a little bit of a repeat. But like the introduction says, my name is Ty. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist working as a training coordinator for the MHDD NTC. It's actually a collaboration between three university centers for excellence on developmental disabilities. One here at Utah State University, another one at University of Alaska Anchorage, and the other one at the University of Kentucky. So we are three sites that are working virtually to create a national training center. And I'll get into the National Training Center at the end as a potential resource for some of these concepts that we talk about throughout the day. So just a little bit of background like myself. As the introduction says, I love spending time in the mountains, so I had to throw a little quick picture in there. But I received my PhD in Human Development and Family Studies, where I emphasized adolescent development and kind of studied the process of how do students on a college campus learn about mental health issues. And it was actually this experience that led me to working with the MHDD NTC, and I'll kind of get into what is mental health literacy and maybe how can we leverage the utility of that to more effectively serve the mental health aspects of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm really interested in neobehavioral therapy, so doing things like acceptance commitment therapy. I'm a trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapist, certified and work a lot with adolescents, and then also have some extra training in dialectical behavior therapy. So what all of this means is that my background is strongly in the mental health components and the mental health aspects of life. And I'm actually newer to the developmental disabilities community. And I think this is actually really important because this is my lens of what is it like being a mental health professional trying to build the bridge to work more effectively with the IDD population and the individuals that serve them. My position currently is the training coordinator for the MHDD NTC. What does this mean? It means basically I help develop and inform the trainings and the mental health advocacy components of these trainings. On the professional staff on the program, I am the lead mental health expert on it, so I kind of serve for all things mental health. And then, like my bio said, licensed marriage and family therapist, where I own and operate a private practice in northern Utah. I think this is especially important because I commonly serve individuals with IDD, and I noticed that a lot of professionals in our community don't necessarily have the training and the background in IDD, but commonly serve these individuals, primarily because we live in a rural area, and we have to see basically everyone that comes through our door because we're the last line of defense on the mental health front. And these experiences are kind of what shaped my expertise in mental health literacy and some of the ideas that we're now kind of leveraging at the National Training Center. So as we progress today, I kind of want to walk through 4 goals. First one is increasing our knowledge of how to identify mental health in individuals with IDD. So how do we exactly do this? I'll review some of the current literature on this topic and kind of what are best practices. But what we'll quickly see is that there aren't necessarily best practices in identifying mental health issues. And so we're going to be proposing some new ideas, and I think these will be applicable for all medical providers and specifically direct care providers, nurses, family members, and community members. Next, we're going to focus on increasing confidence in locating effective resources for the mental health needs of individuals with IDD. So it's kind of talking about the specific resources that are most effective for treating mental health issues in this population. Then increasing ability to effectively respond to the mental health needs of individuals with IDD. And then lastly is learn how to access resources via the MHDD and TC. This 4th one obviously is kind of just summarizing each of these 3 aforementioned goals and how our training center is helping address those needs. I'm really trying to be purposeful with process, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time and kind of link you to the values of the training center that we work with and our approach to working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The first one is use plain language. So I've really tried to be purposeful throughout all my PowerPoint slides and throughout the presentation to use plain language. We can get really lost in complex language that's not necessarily delivering a point any more clearly than more simple language, and it actually makes this field more approachable to everyone, individuals serving individuals with intellectual disabilities and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So as I go through, I'll do my best to use plain language and just recognize that I'm still practicing and learning and growing with all of you. The next one is practicing cultural humility. So at the MHDNTC, we really try to practice cultural humility in all of our interactions. And it's kind of this belief that we're open to new ideas and experiences and appreciating the culture of others, while also accepting cultural practices that may be different than our own and being flexible in how people experience their own culture. And I do my best to educate myself on different cultural topics, but just recognize that we're limited in our knowledge and may not know every person's unique circumstances. I'd really like you to draw your attention to this specific process because as my experience in the mental health field, especially working with individuals with developmental disabilities and self-advocates, I think this one's often the most commonly ignored and commonly disrespected process piece is practicing this cultural humility. So we go through a lot of education, get higher degrees, and have all of this expertise, and sometimes it can put us in a position of like, well, we know. But the reality is we don't know everyone's unique experience, and treatment and kind of resources are so much more effective if we're consistently trying to orient ourselves back to this cultural humility and letting others influence their own journey through the mental health aspects of life. So as we go through this, I'll try to add in a few caveats to each of these process points. And if you have any questions, feel free to just chime in and I'll try to address them as we go throughout the presentation. So I wanted to start by setting the stage. So a little bit about my background is I currently own and operate a private practice here in northern Utah, and I see about 15 to 20 people a week. And often I get referrals from pediatricians because my emphasis is in adolescent development, and that's kind of how I've sold myself. And, you know, in the last few years, I received a referral from a pediatrician who is just basically said, young child, 9, looking for PTSD treatment. So that was the note I received. And, you know, you show up to therapy and you're going, I don't know what actually is going to happen or who this person is going to be or what their unique needs are. And I think that's kind of the fun part of therapy. Well, shortly into my first session with this kiddo, it was pretty clear that he was experiencing delayed language development. As I interacted with his mom, she explained to me that he had been diagnosed with autism when he was about 5, and that since then a lot of language development barriers had kind of occurred, and he was actually really vocal. And I really love this kiddo's personality, but he could communicate a lot through behaviors, but if you weren't oriented to that, it would have been hard to pick up on some of the communication. And so a lot of the training that I received in trying to understand what the mental health needs of someone are so heavily reliant on both, language and vocabulary, that as this was one of my first cases of an individual with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it was hard to wrap my head around how am I going to get the information I need to figure out the mental health aspects of this individual. And I think as we progress around today, this is kind of the most interesting piece of the work that we're doing from my perspective. As I talked to the mom, she explained to me the problems were occurring at home and at school. And the PTSD referral was actually because the kiddo had watched a family member die a few years ago. And so she was worried that maybe he was experiencing some PTSD symptoms, because at school they were saying that he was having really big behavior problems pretty consistently. And that was basically all the information they'd give me, even after I contacted them. So the pediatrician had also tried to medicate the kiddo, but the parent explained the problems just got worse. And I really actually value working with this pediatrician because they recognize that, hey, the tool set that I have isn't necessarily working, but because we had a good collaborative relationship, he was able to reach out to me and we were able to kind of figure out what's the best way to move forward for this kiddo. And so, a mental health referral was really important. And that's also another point that we'll kind of draw on as we're talking about task shifting. So the pediatrician, like I said, was knowledgeable and then used his biopsychosocial understanding of the child and made a referral. But after that session, I was kind of feeling myself going like, what the heck do I do? Because I didn't get the prototypical information you usually would have out of a first session. I didn't have a diagnosis, didn't have an understanding. Is this kiddo experiencing some anxiety? Is he experiencing some depression? As I talked with the mom, she explained to me that she had seen a change in him in the last year, but she wasn't fully sure what was going on. And she didn't really think it was because of the traumatic event, because that happened 2 years ago. So I was kind of just sitting there scratching my head going, what do I do? And I actually use this experience in a lot of my presentations on how do we identify mental health issues in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Because I think it kind of gets at the core points. You're not always going to get the information in the same ways that you might have been trained. You're going to have to focus on collaborating with more people, and you're going to have to be really open to seeing all forms of communication that aren't just verbal. So this leads us to our first goal here, which is identifying mental health issues. So as we review the literature on kind of diagnosis and diagnostic training for mental health providers and medical providers, we see that the diagnostic issues are often listed as the most frequently reported barrier to serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and mental health issues. And this largely is because of how our model of mental health works, is that an individual comes in to get reimbursed for services or to best serve, create a treatment plan. We have to have this, abstract diagnosis. And so this is something that's commonly, as I talk to, the students that are training in our marriage and family therapy program here, they say, well, how do we diagnose? And the reality is that there's this concept called diagnostic overshadowing, and it's where the potential symptoms of like a mental health issue are mistakenly attributed to the developmental disability, and consequently, the MHI is neither diagnosed nor treated. So oftentimes an individual might come into a doctor's office or a mental health provider's office, and they have an intellectual or developmental disability, and the provider might say, this is just attributed to their developmental disability. For instance, for the kiddo that I referenced in the setting the stage slide, he had some pretty intense anxiety going on, is what I later figured out. But the school felt like it was just a behavior problem attributed to his autism. And as I worked with him, I had the experience of working with quite a few kiddos with autism, and it just wasn't adding up to me. And so I was going, this was an example of that diagnostic overshadowing. So I think what you have to do is kind of be introspective of yourself and your own biases and processes that you go through and go, do I just assume or attribute this to someone's developmental disability, or what's the full context or system that this behavior is happening in? And that kind of leads to this idea that the traditional interviewing skills just rely heavily on the verbal language and often forget to explore that environment or the nonverbal communication. I think that it's super important to try to understand, okay, this kiddo's interacting in a big context with friends, with family members that all have their own unique set of circumstances and strengths, and they're also happening in a bigger school system and in a bigger community that may not have as many supports. So it's trying to be conscientious of all of those things to put together a full systemic picture of the mental health aspects. And it's just not the issues, it's the strengths too. So it's remembering to incorporate those strengths into identifying these mental health issues. There are a few, as we look through the literature, several empirically supported tools that can help screen. The one is the Aberrant Behavior Checklist. What it is, it's 58 specific symptoms and provides comprehensive descriptions for each assessed behavior. So these items revolve into 5 subscales that assesses for irritability, social withdrawal, stereotypical behavior, hyperactive noncompliance, and inappropriate speech. Well, if I'm being completely honest, this tool set isn't necessarily useful in collaborating with community members or collaborating with the families that you're working with. If I go back to my plain language approach and think about that, 5 subscales, provides comprehensive descriptions. It creates a lot of these barriers in between the people you're serving and the communities that are providing the most resources for them, which are going to help improve the mental health aspects of life. So it's trying to figure out, how do we use these tool sets in a way that actually includes more community members into the process, which we'll talk about that task shifting here in just a second. And just if you're curious too, the mood, interest, and pleasure questionnaire, what that assesses more for is depression or depression symptoms. There's 12 items that assess for mood and 13 items in interest and pleasure. It's been validated in populations of individuals with severe intellectual disabilities. So if we're thinking about that though, that process, the takeaways from what the literature is saying is diagnostic overshadowing occurs often. It's hard to really identify, the mental health aspects of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, often using the same kind of training procedures that we receive in our programs. So we have to kind of start rethinking how we're going to do this. I think the first step is we need to gather information from more people and from varying perspectives. If you're familiar with the DSM-5, it talks about putting together a psychosocial evaluation. Well, as I've worked with providers, what I often realize is that they kind of skip through this and don't see the utility in it. As I've started working more commonly with individuals with developmental disabilities, I've recognized how crucial this component is, because not only does it help me understand maybe some of the mental health issues that are going on, but it helps me identify the unique strengths and resources that are going to really help bolster the mental health aspects of this individual. So it's asking questions on where does this person spend most of their time? What resources are available in their community? What types of relationships does the family have? Asking, what type of resources are available at the school? So it's trying to put together this full systemic biopsychosocial picture of the individual, and including medical providers into that is crucial for success. So it's trying to start developing these interdisciplinary teams where we can have kind of open conversations about, okay, what are the strengths and where are the areas that we might be able to enhance to try to help improve kind of these mental health aspects. Second, I think it's really important to focus on moving away from that traditional medical model of dysfunction and view, intellectual and developmental disabilities as a natural occurring piece of the human experience. My Ph.D. training is in adolescent development, and I can very distinctly remember throughout my entire Ph.D. program talking about normative development. And whenever we talked about individuals with developmental disabilities, it was a non-normative developmental trajectory. And it's, to me, as I go into the utility of practice, I think that's actually a really big service, as I see, IDD as a naturally occurring piece of the human experience. And there are unique challenges and also unique strengths that these individuals possess. And my job as a clinician is to try to figure out, how do I emphasize these strengths and leverage them to best support the person? And third, it's this idea of, okay, if we're trying to identify, can we promote mental health literacy? So getting more than just medical providers, or getting more than just mental health providers, or professionals aware of mental health issues. And how do we shift that more to a community approach of making everyone aware of these and what they might look in an individual with IDD, so that we can have more information gatherers for us, because then it will lead to more support, which we're seeing that in the mental health field specifically. If you're interested in it, Jorm and colleagues, they have a lot of information on mental health literacy that can kind of help you understand that approach in more detail, but that's a bit beyond the scope of our task today. But as we consider that mental health literacy and trying to gather more information, one of the things that we've talked about with our National Training Center is this task shifting. And so our training center really focuses on supporting direct care staff in facilities, because they're the individuals that are most likely to be interacting with individuals with developmental disabilities in the professional community most often and most regularly. So it's, can we shift these ideas of, or this process of identifying mental health issues from just the professionals to shifting it to, more community members and these direct care staff providers to, how do we identify what might be a warning sign of a mental health issue like anxiety or depression or schizophrenia or bipolar? And are there specific warning signs that if we're aware of them, we'll be able to pick up on behavioral cues quicker? I think yes, and the literature is pretty clear on this. The World Health Organization has also been promoting this for the last decade, is task shifting. We see these kind of processes done in Uganda. There's a pretty cool TEDx talk about it too that I really like. If you type in task shifting into YouTube, it will pull it up. But the idea is, can we actually empower more people to be mental health advocates so we can create a bigger community of support? So at this point, I usually ask myself, okay, so what are the practical steps for addressing that goal one of identifying mental health issues? And I think for providers, it's rallying the team. I used to work at a community health center, which basically I work side by side with medical providers. And what we found is that the more connected we stayed and kind of understood each other, the better information we got and the better the client was served. So it's rallying the team. In this case, it's rallying your community fully. So it's, what are the supports at school? What are the supports that the family has? What is the support the community offers just in, daily programming of staying connected? And then how do medical providers and how do the mental health providers all stay connected and have clear communication? Because we all have super busy schedules. For me, it depends on each provider I work with. Some providers want more detailed interaction more regularly. Others want a sentence, literally a sentence email once a week saying what's going on. So you have to kind of learn that, and you just interact with different relationships and you'll learn as you go. But I think rallying the team and making that an emphasis really is going to help serve your clients much more effectively. The second one is identifying baselines and strengths. So if we go back to that story of the kiddo with autism that might have had PTSD, it was really important for me to kind of identify the baseline. So asking about school, what was going on? Did he change? Did he start isolating himself more? And trying to also understand the strengths. So what does this kiddo specifically do? The kiddo that I was working with really loved to draw, and he was a good artist. He was like a very talented artist, and so he always liked to draw things. So if I asked him questions about his feelings, he could draw it really well and communicate that way. And I actually learned that trick from a speech language pathologist, which goes back to the first point, is rallying the team, making sure you're working with interdisciplinary teams, because we all have different ideas from our backgrounds. And so it's trying to, how do we leverage each one of those strengths in the team? And once you get these baselines identified and the strengths identified, you're able to track changes. So once you get someone's care and you have them consistently under your care, which is the best basically the best service that we can provide is staying consistent with care, is that we can track changes. So now we can understand what might be more attributed to a mental health issue or something changing in the environment versus what might be attributed to a developmental disability. Helps us kind of eliminate that diagnostic overshadowing approach. So the idea is once we get the mental health issue identified, or if we can even get it identified, its next thing is how do we actually locate these effective resources? And as we reviewed the literature on this, we did a pretty systematic literature review on individual and systemic oriented therapies for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this is a very, very brief overview of what we found. Basically, there were 5 therapies that came back that said, yep, there's research behind them and they seem to be effective. Applied behavior analysis, cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical therapy, mindfulness, and family-based interventions. I'm not going to go specifically into each one of those therapies and what the literature is behind it because I want to kind of shift your approach to a bigger macro level issue. But if you're interested in learning more about those, you can feel free to reach out to me and I can help direct you to some of our resources. But as you might notice, each one of these therapies, and if you get into them, really heavily focuses on behavior and what we can see. So this is both a strength and a weakness because a lot of individuals I've worked with have viewed the behavior as being attributed solely to a developmental disability. And they view that behavior as often negative and with a lot of bias in it. And as soon as that bias and that negativity of the behavior comes in, it really kind of thwarts the interventions or thwarts the services that we're able to provide. So it's trying to remember that this behavior is happening, but it always happens in a specific cultural context. And once we start understanding that it always happens in behavior, I viewed it as more of a communication device. So for instance, we go back to the kiddo that I was working with. He was at school and he was often telling people that he was seeing things. I'm seeing people. And that's why the pediatrician initially thought maybe he's having flashbacks and that could be what the PTSD is. Well, as I kind of talked to the teachers and talked to the parents, the behavior was always happening at a very specific time when he was getting anxious about leaving the classroom. And so he was saying that because he realized as soon as he did that, he didn't have to leave. The teachers would put all of his attention into him and I work with him. So I remember that happens within context, and we figured out, oh, he's just trying to communicate. He's a little nervous about leaving. And so we were able to kind of set up some resources for him that he was able to feel less nervous, and then he started going on classroom field trips all the time and really loved them. But if I didn't remember that, okay, this behavior is both communication and he's not trying to just be troublesome, and it's not just because of a developmental disability that he's having this behavior, that he could be actually communicating to us and we need to understand it. It really helped shift the conversation away from bias and goes, how do we best support this young kiddo's mental health? And so it's remembering that our overall goal with locating effective resources is more about focusing on the emotional wellness of the individual rather than trying to give them a specific protocol treatment that's going to change a specific behavior. As I've started getting more integrated with individuals with autism and the communities that they represent, they'll tell you horror stories about ABA. And as I've talked to them, I think there's some utility in the ABA practices, but what they've often explained to me is that they go, we have emotions too, and they completely ignores it, and we feel like we're treated like robots. So that story really stuck out to me because I thought, man, I've really got to be careful on how I view behavior and I don't insert the bias into it. I'm really trying to see it as a way of communication. And if we use these therapies and these resources in a way that helps promote wellness rather than on trying to change the behavior, I think we're going to get a lot more positive outcomes in regards to emotional wellness. So unfortunately, I wish I could take credit for all that I did, but I can't. And what we're actually seeing in the literature is a lot of shifting away from individually based treatments that focus on behavior and more models of care. One specific model of care that we see in the literature is called community intellectual disability services. So it uses a multidisciplinary team approach by fostering a partnership among diverse providers from primary healthcare, disability services, and mental health care. So what this looks like is this team comes together weekly and has a specific clientele and caseload, and they really consult with each case. So it's pretty basic system. It's IDT, an interdisciplinary team. But one of the caveats to this system is that there's stigma increased due to separation, but current services aren't capable of handling needs. Let me kind of explain what I mean by that. So is this specific model of care separates services or segregates the services. So it kind of takes individuals with developmental disabilities and say, hey, we're going to insert you into this specific model of care. There is a lot of pushback in the developmental disability community about segregation and separating the services, and I think rightfully so, because of the stigma it increases. We've also seen that throughout history with the mental health field until John F. Kennedy kind of passed the Community Mental Health Act. So how do we not segregate and include in services if the services aren't necessarily capable of handling the needs? I think that's kind of the forefront that we're going to be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years is how do we start addressing that more systematically? Some states are doing beautifully at this. Other states are struggling primarily because of just funding issues. But I think a takeaway about this is if you can create interdisciplinary teams in your communities, you're going to have a lot more effective outcomes. And that is kind of what the START program is trying to do. START program stands for the Systematic Therapeutic Assessment, Resources, and Treatment. It was developed by another university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. And the idea behind their program is they serve individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are at the most crises cases. So it's individuals that are, maybe having consistent self-harming behaviors, maybe consistent suicide attempts or consistent family conflict where they're getting into physical altercations with the family. And often how the system currently handles these types of cases is we hospitalize them. Well, if you've been through a hospitalization process or have understanding about the financial pieces of that, we see that an average hospital stay costs anywhere between $20,000 to $30,000 in a behavioral health unit. Granted, I know there are a lot of insurance, that will pay for components of that treatment, but the average family, it costs them a lot of money and it doesn't necessarily resolve what's causing the problem. And so this is just one area where we go, the system isn't working. And so START Services has really tried to develop a plan where they create these interdisciplinary teams wherever they go. They identify medical providers that are interested in serving the population, much like probably many of the attendees. They identify mental health professionals that may not have the expertise, but are interested in learning and are willing to collaborate and kind of go through the IDT process. And they find, communities of support and direct care providers that are willing to keep involved with the team to better serve these needs. What they see is that it costs about $9,500 on average per person to run these programs, but that's versus a $30,000 hospital visit. It takes multiple years for states to kind of create this programming, but what we see is improved outcomes for individuals, less hospitalizations, and more, it promotes the strengths of these individuals and improves their emotional wellness. So it doesn't just take the behavior and tries to change the behavior. It tries to fundamentally shift the system. And that's what these model cares do, is shift the system away from trying to just change behavior to how do we best support and bolster and emphasize the strengths of the individual to promote their mental health. So again, I'd be asking myself, well, what are the practical steps to identifying or locating these evidence-based resources? Well, the first thing you can do is just start becoming knowledgeable about what the resources are in your community. Are there mental health providers with specialties in intellectual and developmental disabilities? Are there community resources that are willing to support or provide services? And it's really just doing a scan, because a lot of the families I've worked with, they've explained to me I've had to become an expert because no one we've talked to in the medical community or the mental health community knows the resources. So often when I talk with parents, they're far, far more knowledgeable about all the resources available than I am. So I just try to be quiet and I listen and I try to learn from them to learn the resources in our community. It's important that wherever you move to recognize them, recognize the people that are working with them, and how open are they to collaboration, because those that are open to more collaboration, it's going to be a lot more helpful for the supporting mental health. And that kind of goes into this second piece, which is establishing the relationships. So it's really important to put in the footwork to establish relationships. I know it's pretty basic, but we know that with providing healthcare, providing mental health services, the relationship is so predictive of positive outcomes when it comes to mental health that it's important. We also need to practice what we preach a little bit on that and try to establish high quality relationships with these community resources and be open to maintaining them. To do that, it takes time. And I know time is a valuable commodity that we can't always do. So it's trying to figure out how do we establish and maintain those relationships. It may be creating clinics that actually have everyone in one house, or it might just be finding ways to collaborate effectively through, note sharing. Those types of programs are up and running right now, and we're testing those types of things. Then the last time is respect self-advocacy. This isn't a value that I've covered in the slides, but with the MHDD NTC, our emphasis is on sharing the voices of individuals with lived experience, whether it be their families or it be individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But what we try to do is focus so much on what is the actual experience for these individuals and how do we help strengthen them, because too often these voices are neglected, unheard, and really kind of just brushed aside, and we go, oh, well, here's a therapy for you. We know it works. But that therapy might not actually be what the individual needs, might not actually really help support their overall strains. So it's really making sure that self-advocacy is heard and that their decisions are supported and that they have the resources that they need to make informed decisions and in ways that they feel comfortable doing. Again, takes more time. You can't just, slap a solution on it and then kick the person out the door. You have to really spend some time trying to connect with individuals and respect kind of their perspectives on things so you can deliver more informed services. I think if you focus on these three steps, you're able to start going, okay, we can identify these evidence-based resources or effective resources for enhancing emotional wellness. But that doesn't necessarily help us understand how to respond to mental health issues. So when an individual, with an intellectual and developmental disability comes to your office and you're not a mental health provider, I was trying to think of what's the most helpful thing I've ever learned in the field to kind of give us a skill set. And I'm going to steal from Mental Health First Aid, which is developed by Jordan Kitchener out of Australia. And they have this acronym called ALGIE. And ALGIE always sticks with me. It's first is assessing for risk. So as someone comes in and they're explaining there are some mental health aspects that are, might be going awry, it's trying to figure out, is this person at potential risk for self-harm? Here at our university, we have a program called Aggies Elevated. It brings individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities onto our campus, and they're going to school full time. And one of the kiddos that came into the program, I guess he's an adolescent, I can't say kiddo, but one of the adolescents came in and was experiencing some suicidal ideation. And through that, we referred them to a mental health provider that didn't have training or even really experience working with individuals with IDD. And they basically just sent them back to us and said, oh, there's no problem. Well, we sent them to someone with more training, and they were able to assess the risk and said, yeah, there is actually potential. There's some serious potential risk. So assessing for risk, usually what I look for, are there potentials for suicide or self-risk behaviors or danger to someone else? So threat of harm to self or others. I don't have enough time to go specifically how to do that effectively, but there are some positive resources, and we are covering some of that in our training modules that we're developing for the National Training Center. Next one is listen non-judgmentally. So it's really trying to put your perspectives aside and really try to get a thorough systematic understanding of what's going on. Listen to the person non-judgmentally, respecting that self-advocacy and respecting their perspective, even if it might not align with what you know or what your experience might be. Give reassurance and information to both the individual and their family. So they're coming in, they're most likely very overwhelmed. The language that we use to describe mental health or medical processes are complicated. I don't think they're very user-friendly, and they're not very plain language approach. So it's giving some reassurance and making sure someone actually knows what we're offering in the information that we're providing. Next is encouraging appropriate professional help. One of the biggest resources I think any professional can be is actually help identify the right professional to get in contact with. It is one of the most frustrating things for these families to come in and they go, oh, go here or go there or try to use this resource. So one of the things I think we can do as providers is try to go, what are the actual most appropriate resources that are going to help the most and the most quickly, and really kind of helping people that come through our doors identify those resources. Next is encouraging self-help and other support strategies. We're actually implementing right now kind of some mindfulness interventions for both families and individuals with IDD to see kind of how that influences these mental health aspects. And so far, some of our preliminary results are positive. We're seeing that if you look in mindfulness interventions with acceptance commitment therapy in the literature right now, they're adapting services to better meet their individuals with IDD's needs, and really promising results. And we're launching a study here at Utah State to kind of serve families using these same mindfulness approaches. So how can we use those self-help strategies to create more of a community of support rather than just throwing it all on, the providers are going to fix it? Because I don't think that strategy is effective for really incorporating more emotional wellness. So what are the practical steps here for goal 3? It would be first, ground your self in strengths-based approaches. It's really hard when you're assessing for risk to remember to go, oh yeah, there are some unique strengths this individual is bringing in, and we should really try to draw on those because those are going to be the most helpful in helping provide safety and helping us get the access to the most effective resources. Second is knowing the actual signs of crises, especially for individuals with IDD. Again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but I think it's worthwhile investing some time into what are suicide risk warning signs, and also what might those look like in differing populations, because they do vary by culture and they do vary by different other underlying mental health issues, as well as if an individual has a developmental disability. And then lastly, respecting self-advocacy. I think this is so important when you're dealing with someone's emotional wellness, especially in crisis or responding to mental health issues and referring to specific resources, is asking them what do they think about that resource, or asking them what do they think about what you guys are talking about, and getting their input so you can adapt and kind of keep them motivated, but also keeping them as the captain of the ship. I think it's so important, and it's not done enough. So what are the takeaways on kind of these 3 goals? Well, I think first it's, grounding yourself in that biopsychosocial understanding of people. Hopefully, as you've heard me talk throughout this presentation, you're kind of seeing how we keep orienting back to a systemic overview evaluation of the person and trying to understand what are all the things that could be influencing their emotional wellness. Second is doing your best to emphasize these strengths of an individual and system. As I've worked with individuals with, for instance, physical disabilities, or and people with, individuals with developmental disabilities, they'll often say, as a provider, I've talked to providers and they just say, oh, you've got a developmental disability, and they go deficit, deficit, deficit. And so if you can really orient yourself to identifying the strengths of that individual the very first time they walk through the door, it's going to enhance their relationship, and it's really going to help improve kind of accessing the right resources to promote emotional wellness. And that leads to this point. So being client-led and respect the advocacy and efforts of the individual. Then lastly, just make sure you're really aware of the warning signs and effective helps for mental health issues. So these takeaways right here, I'm hoping you're kind of going, Well, we didn't go all over, over every single one of those in a way that I feel, extremely competent. Well, we've recognized that, and we've recognized, the Administration for Community Living, who funds the MHDD NTC Center, has said, wow, we really do need trainings that, medical providers can access, mental health providers, direct care providers, direct service providers, everyone, community members, family members can access to better understand how do we identify mental health issues. And that's kind of the idea behind the MHDD Center, this is our website, mhddcenter.org. So we promote quality mental health care and supports for people with developmental disabilities, providing access to information, resources, and training. So what we're trying to do is we're working towards a world in where people with disabilities have access to desired mental health care while remaining free of bullying, forced treatment, and discrimination. Society in which the voices of people with disabilities are central to conversations concerning disability and mental health, and a mental health care system capable of serving everyone regardless of disability status. And we try to promote this through each of the resources that we provide. So what do we actually do? Well, we provide training. So we're currently running a Project ECHO and of the University of Alaska. Project ECHO focuses on providing interdisciplinary teams with case simulations and walking them through specifics of what you might do from leading experts in the MHDD community. We're also developing online trainings currently, which I think our first ones will be live on November 1st on our website. These are for providers, direct care staff, and self-advocates and families. Our first kind of round of trainings are helping individuals identify mental health issues and the mental health aspects of life in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As we've talked to providers, as we've reviewed literature, we've realized that's probably the very first most important step, is figuring out how do we even identify this and get it away from diagnostic overshadowing and moving it more towards a systematic understanding or a systemic understanding of the individual. We also provide a thing what we call Voices, which focuses on virtual storytelling and the MHDD podcast. So we work hard to incorporate the voices of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So they're telling their stories of experiences with providers, telling their stories of experiences with specific services they've received, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, and providing these in ways to kind of empower self-advocacy and making sure that what we do is always grounded and centered in their voice and what they want. Our podcast is something I was talking about before the beginning of the presentation that we're really excited about. You can find it here at the mhdcenter.podbean.com. We interview leading experts in the field, self-advocates, individuals with maybe not experience an IDD, but they're interested in getting into it. So we can have these real life conversations that provide you in a short 15 to 30 minute, I think they're usually 15 minutes, podcast. Here's some how-tos to enhance or improve your skills in working with these population. And then lastly, our resources. So we're currently developing fact sheets related to resources for both community members and providers, both medical providers and mental health providers. So trying to draw attention or quick, here's a how to identify mental health issues. Here are some direct links to resources in communities across the United States that might be useful. And as part of that resources component, we're also compiling nationally accredited resources. So there are other people in the field that are already doing a lot of this work and have provided trainings, but it's really hard to access them. They're often, buried in the depths of the interweb. So we're spending a lot of time trying to go out, identify those resources, identify the high quality ones, and then kind of make them more apparent via our website. And we already have some of those listed on there. So if you're interested in going to the website, you can see some of these resources that are already live, and it will help you start getting more exposed to how do I actually start identifying mental health issues and responding to them effectively in the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it looks like I talked a little bit quickly, but this will be great because it leaves us a bit of time to ask questions if there are any. I'd be happy to, as they pop up in chat, to kind of respond to them. Or if you're curious about specific resources or maybe some of the specific steps that we talked about in each one of those goals, I'd be happy to kind of hang out here for a little bit and try to address some of those questions. But thank you for your time. It was a fun opportunity, and it was genuinely fun putting this together, trying to figure out what's the best way to deliver this information in a concise hour. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. The first question I have on the sidebar, it says, will the PowerPoint be posted after this session?
I am happy to provide the PowerPoint. I do not know how to do that, so I would love to work with you to get it up for people.
Okay, yeah, I usually I'll just email you. That's fine. Are there any other questions right now? There's no other questions at this time, but I have a question.
Yeah, go.
As like a physician, and like when you hear about people wanting or hearing voices, or maybe you assume they're suicidal, or they do say they're suicidal and that's not the main reason, and they're using, that's their way of communicating something different. What are some main signs that you can tell, like let's say in a crisis situation where you're trying to see what, like compare or try to see what's really going on?
I really appreciate that question, because that, the case that I referenced throughout this presentation, that was actually the exact referral I got. Was the kiddo was explaining that he was hearing voices, and it was childhood onset schizophrenia is incredibly rare, to like depression. And so I was naturally kind of skeptical. And as I talked to the family, I took them seriously because I wanted to make sure that wasn't going on. But as I talked to the family, I realized that one, they hadn't really seen any of the what we call positive symptoms or negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which are, maybe more flat affect, disorientation, not being able to track. Even though this kiddo wasn't speaking to me verbally, he was able to track everything I was saying and would respond by pointing to pictures or something to that effect. So it's trying to identify maybe some of the other ways of behavior that kind of flatten out when we see, for instance, schizophrenia. So I think, if we're looking at a macro view, it's trying to be aware of the symptom clusters that come with mental health issues, which is some of what our trainings will help you do. Is like, okay, with depression, here's what we look for generally with mood. With anxiety, here are some warning signs of anxiety. With suicide risk, here are some warning signs. And it's trying to just be attuned to those so that when you get a positive screen, we get them to the right professional, which would be a mental health professional, to do a more thorough assessment. If you're in a crisis, I think the best way to do is you ask the family member that usually joins someone with a crisis, and you track down when did the behavior shift and how rapid the shifting was. But more of an answer would be like a full diagnostics class. But I think overall, that's kind of the process I would go to. And then just kind of deferring to that ALGE and acronym that we went over.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can you talk a bit about the intersection of dementia and those with IDD, resources, best practice, etc.? I find that mental health and behaviors tie in with this dual diagnosis very frequently.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, before I became a therapist, I actually worked as a volunteer for a hospice group. And the group that I served most commonly were the aging population that had dementia and also had mental health issues, and very often had intellectual and developmental disabilities. And from a diagnostic standpoint, now as a clinician, I go, wow, that's very, very complicated and requires an interdisciplinary team. For me, though, from just trying to promote emotional wellness, especially as community members, what we know is that social interaction and not arguing with kind of reality is some of the best support strategies you can work with an individual that might have dementia. So for instance, an individual with dementia will often, get confused about specifics or the truthfulness of specific, events. And so instead of arguing, it's supporting them in it and providing social interaction, and then just making sure that safety is always there. As far as community resources, that's not necessarily my emphasis area, but I do believe that we provide some of those resources on the website. I'm trying to connect with, the aging population specifically is how do we better serve, individuals, the mental health aspects of individuals with dementia. That's a whole grouping area that we've looked into. So not a direct answer, but a overview is social support and just making sure that they're connected and not isolated.
Okay. I think that's all for right now. So I'll contact you an email and try to get all these contacts and people who registered to get your PowerPoint out in your email.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so very much. And thanks for, helping facilitate.
Thank you. I learned a lot. Have a good
Awesome.
night.
You too. Talk to you later.